Hello, students. Just a brief introduction. Uh, I'm from Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. I guess you know Bangkok. It's the capital city of Thailand, and um, actually my background was on European Union studies. Yeah, so it's a bit weird that have black hair and study the EU. But today I will focus on because Hannah assigned me to do something about Asian. So I try to relate myself as the EU or the European Union followers with ASEAN, which is one of the important regionalism in Southeast Asia, and the relationship for the first part, and the second part going to be the relationships with Thailand, EU and Thailand, right? So let's start with ASEAN. Does anyone know what ASEAN stands for, or the member states? Any ideas? Have you heard about ASEAN? Anything come across to your mind?
Yeah. Association of Southeast Asian nations.
Yes, correct. Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So we now have 10 members, which is Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Indonesia, um, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, Brunei. We are about to cover our entire sub-region, which is Southeast Asia. Can you guess? There's one country that haven't been the members of ASEAN yet, but about to enter. Can you guess which country in that sub-region? It's a new state. Have you heard about East Timor or Timor-Leste? Yeah, it's very small country. It's about to enter ASEAN. So, so you see that from the size and the number, ASEAN and EU is quite asymmetrical from the beginning. So that's why I put in the slides. And in terms of integration, in terms of pathways, in terms of focus also have a different stories, but they are very close to one another. Okay, let's start with some some notes, some remarks that um, ASEAN and EU approaches to regionalism differ markedly, with epistemological comparisons between ASEAN and EU permissible but unnecessary. What does it mean? It means that in the past, when we study, like in 1990s or 1980s, um, there were attempts to compare ASEAN and the EU. And then the result is very singular, in which ASEAN is very underdeveloped compared to the EU in terms of integration. Because I think you're familiar with the EU more. The European Union, you need to sacrifice certain of sovereignty, right, to the central authority or to Brussels. So when you use the theoretical, which is Eurocentric or European based or European focus, and you try to compare ASEAN, of course, ASEAN is going to be like failed or understand that in terms of European concepts. So that's why I put a note that, well, the comparison is permissible but unnecessary because they were ontological, epistemological, very different between these two organizations. But when it comes to the relations in which I call interregionalism, when you use the word interregionalism, you see the keyword, right? Like international and region. And I prefer to call ASEAN as regionalism, EU as regionalism, rather than international organization. Well, there were like the lawyer or the legal professor going to call EU as an international organization in which that upset the EU a lot because they see themselves as something bigger than international organization like United Nations or the World Trade Organizations. So to put up front about the the decades, there were both flows and ebbs in the ASEAN and EU interregionalism. There were flows at the beginning in the 80s, and then there were ebbs during the times of uh, Burmese military junta created a coup against Aung San Suu Kyi. So there were 2 decades of apps in 1990s and 2000s, and you can guess because the EU uphold their normative value, their normative power, in which democracy must be put ahead, rule of law, and human rights. So there were apps during that time in the 1990s and 2000s, and then there were flows again in 2010 and 2020. Okay. Well, if you want to know more, like, because if you don't know the background, also want to know more, you can interrupt me anytime, okay? So when we start with the ASEAN and EU during the 80s, we see a lot of asymmetrical indifference. Why the asymmetrical indifference? Because in a way they were unequal, but they have some common connector in which I use the word indifference. Okay. In 1977, the European Community, the previous organization before the EU, became ASEAN's first dialogue partner. They applied to be ASEAN first dialogue partner even before China, South Korea, and Japan. And they did this after ASEAN just finished creating the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta and arranged a summit in 1976. However, that interaction remained very low. What are the indifferent? What are the similarity between these two? Because both ASEAN and the EC are very close, both were very close to the US. And the US are their political midwife. But the approach of the US is different between these two regions. In Southeast Asia, the US held militarily in terms of bilateral military ties, like Thai-US military base and Philippines US military base. But in the case of Europe, as you know, after the Second World War, the US shared the burden of the security through NATO or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So one is more in using multilateral organization in Europe, but in Southeast Asia, they use bilateral engagement. So not all 11 ASEAN countries. So we can see that both ASEAN and EZ were the spokes in a system centered on the North American hub that time. And that focus are different. ASEAN comprised of newly founded states, former colonies of the West, except Thailand. So there were a lot of border disputes, both on lands and on maritimes. So ASEAN only focus on how to solve the border disputes by using this ASEAN mechanism. But the EC, they're concerned with economic integration process, as you know that they start from European coal and steel community, and then they have Treaty of Rome, they have common market, and then they have Euro currency, they have the European Union. So the focus was different at the beginning. And then the next decade in the 90s, in the 90s, like I previously said, there's emerging stumbling blocks because during the 90s, we can say that the mainstream of the Cold War was ended there. I mean, you may argue that the Cold War is still going on, right? Because of the situation nowadays. But the mainstream Cold War was ended when the Berlin Wall fell, and then the dissolve of the Soviet Union, and then the German West and East reunification. So both regionalism, ASEAN, and the EU were preoccupied with the enlargement. So ASEAN will accept like new member like CLMV. We have like abbreviation CLMV, which is Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. They just accept them like how to say, like automatically without any criteria. But in the case of the EU, when you are going to enter the European Union, you need to match the criteria, right? Or have you familiar with the Copenhagen criteria of the EU? Because I believe that Ukraine also wanna be and apply in the EU. What is Copenhagen criteria? Or any ideas like you want to be the EU members? What are the bare minimum that you should have?
It's like the requirement, like the set of requirements for the countries which are integrated into the EU, which consists of some economic requirements, which are not easy to follow, let's say, in a short period of time, some legislation, harmonization, and like other things which are required for the countries which are which want to be a part of the European Union.
Right. You mentioned about the law harmonization, the acquis communautaire, and then the economic criteria, the well-functioning market economy, which is quite difficult. And then the other thing is you need to be like democracy and protection of minority rights. Yeah, the three criteria of the EU. But in ASEAN, we didn't impose any criteria. We just accept all communist countries, all socialist countries in the association. And when Vietnam signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, or TAC, it's like you have like in the past you have Warsaw Pact, right? Right. You have the pact or the treaty that is a side of the First World and the Second World. And then you have the Second World side, the First World treaty, like the Vietnam is a socialist country, and side the treaty that originally is the enemy adversary treaty to the socialist country. So it's marked that the Cold War had ended in Southeast Asia. And then in the 90s, the EU started to expand their missions, right? Before that, they are only focused on economic integration and monetary integration. And then they start to have a certain kind like diplomatic organs like foreign policy, like European External Action Service, like the like you have Joseph Borrell now, you have Federica Mogherini in the past, and now you have the lady, which is the Prime Minister of the Baltic, one of the Baltic countries. Who's the HRVP now? Right. So the EU external relations now, when they have this kind of mechanism of foreign policies, means they start to shift it from their only focus. Before they only focus on transatlantic relationship, in which Ukraine was in this one. They start to expand to be the global actor roles. And so they're interested in ASEAN, and they have come to ASEAN into two types of relationship. The first relationship is by region, Brussels, EU, and the ASEAN Secretariat, which is in Jakarta, Indonesia. So only two regionalism. And then the second is the region to state type of relations, like EU approached Thailand directly, or EU approached Singapore directly for doing the free trade agreement, for example. So there were two approaches of the EU. However, it's not going anywhere in the 90s because the stumbling blocks of the Burma or Myanmar. Well, in 1988, right? You haven't, I think you haven't born yet. That's like, but you know Aung San Suu Kyi, right? The Burmese lady who got the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Yeah, she was ousted by the military, by the dictator of the junta. So, and there were also serials of Myanmar's human rights abuse, so which make ASEAN and EU dialogue pause and not take place from 1997 to 2000 for 3 years. And then in 1997, our region was hit by Asian financial crisis. So that time, there were new major powers that stepped in and helped Southeast Asian countries, which we call ASEAN plus 3. You remember that EU is the first person who be our dialogue partner. But ASEAN plus 3 are coming later, but become more important. There were Japan, China, and South Korea. So they come to help and give us the loan and help with the swapping facilities of financial at that time. So the idea become like, we try to crystallize the idea of ASEAN with the broader East Asian states, in which ASEAN becomes central to this engineering. So ASEAN, you will, if you read the article of ASEAN, you will see a lot of occurring of ASEAN centrality in the text. So in the next decade, 2000, in 2000, the two actors try to overcome stumbling blocks or try to restore relationships of after the Myanmar human rights abuse. So in 2007, ASEAN launched the ASEAN Charter, and ASEAN Charter talk a lot about human rights. Even at present, I think we didn't really care about human rights, in ASEAN countries. But we have in documents ASEAN Charter on human rights. And under German presidency of the EU, so the German chairmanship of the EU, they launched the 2007 Nuremberg Declaration on ASEAN EU Enhanced Partnership. And then in 2009, the EU has the Treaty of Lisbon, and they start to have the foreign minister post, or we call it HRVP, or High Representative for Foreign Affairs, right? So since this 2007 Nuremberg, EU a kind of a bit change of mind and become pivot to ASEAN, pivot to Asia, and try to support ASEAN-centered multilateralism in East Asia and Asia Pacific. And the EU even signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation of ASEAN Regional Forum, in which the forum focused purely on security issue, both traditional security and non-traditional security. So it shows that the EU commit to the ASEAN-led East Asian institutional order. Then 2015, there's a document called EU-ASEAN Partnership for Strategic Purpose. And the EU start to use the word like-minded countries a lot, and including ASEAN. However, in 2010s, like I told you before, that there were two channels, right? The bi-regionalism, EU and ASEAN, one track. And the other one, EU region to state, EU as a region to individual state. EU tried to negotiate FTA, or free trade agreements, with ASEAN as a bi-region, but it failed because it's hard to reconcile different interests, different tariffs, different focus with the 10 ASEAN countries. So now the EU changed its strategy from bi-region to region to state to doing FTA, or we call it ASEAN minus. So EU be able to talk to Singapore and Vietnam and conclude the free trade agreement with the two countries out of 10 because it's easier. And they hope that it's like spaghetti bowl. They hope that if the two countries will succeed, the other countries in Southeast Asia will follow. So the region to state FTA might have positive effects on region to region relationship in the future overall. And now Thailand are negotiating the FTA with the EU. So you see that EU funded ASEAN a lot for the institutional support. There were regional EU-ASEAN Dialogue Instrument, or REDI, 2011, 2015, support funds for human rights dialogue under the REDI, 2016 to 2020, and the same continue of the dialogue instrument. And also ASEAN received regional integration support from the EU, which is very interesting in 2013 and 2022. Because you know that EU worked toward a federal state, worked toward the supranationalism, but ASEAN it's sovereigntist, very nationalist. So they integrate in the sovereigntist way. But EU gave ASEAN money without forcing ASEAN that, oh, you need to have the common policy, like common farm policy, common agricultural policy, or you should have you should try to give up some part of sovereignty like the EU, right? And then the EU support measures under the common market, we call it ASEAN Economic Community. And then in the light of connectivity, you may heard about China Belt and Road initiatives, right? That China invests a lot for this hardware connectivity in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia. So this connectivity is a really important and trouble the major power. So the way that the EU engage in connectivity in Southeast Asia, the EU continue to push certain agendas that have repercussions for the larger East Asian region. And the EU avoid doing or using the hardware thing, like come to build the road, something like that, not like Chinese way. So ASEAN themselves also launched connectivity master plan, right? Which try to engage China, Japan, South Korea, US, and the EU. So the EU try not to launch region-to-region connectivity projects. So they provide only know-how or sustainability knowledge and innovation. So in 2018, there were the document called Connecting Asia and Europe Building Blocks for an EU strategy. So from 2020, as I told you that we have 10 countries in ASEAN, Timor-Leste haven't in yet. So the partnership and cooperation agreement, the PCA, was signed with 6 countries, which is Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. And 2 FTA was passed through, which is Singapore and Vietnam. And EU ASEAN become strategic partners in 2020. So they commit to have the regular summits or leaders level, and 4 main areas of cooperation includes economic security, sustainable connectivity, and sustainable development. And in 2021, you heard a lot about Indo-Pacific now. The EU also launched its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is very regionalization, which is a kind of constructivism in which they try to merge the 2 oceans, which is in Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean together. And there were 5 waterways such as South China Sea, Malacca Strait, Taiwan Straits. So it's a kind of economically attractive area, and it is also very has a very high tension of flashpoints, of security flashpoints. And then in 2022, after Russia invasion in Ukraine, the EU launched the strategic compass in 2022. And then you see a lot of words like-minded in this document. And then what are the factors that explaining the upgraded ASEAN and EU relations? Because at the 80s, you see that it's a kind of unequal. It's a kind of donor recipient, like the EU just give us money and then write a check, and then ASEAN country get the money and then develop their countries. But now you see that in the 2010, the EU adapted to ASEAN way a lot. And sometimes the EU relaxed its norm, like not that harsh on human rights, right? What are the factors explaining? The first one is the EU had to grow to accommodate changing global dynamics. The US-China, US rivalries. You've seen that from the chips war, from the trade wars that launched since Donald Trump first round. And then you see that the way that the EU commit to ASEAN-led East Asian institutional architecture is a kind of tacit approval of ASEAN norms by external parties. And ASEAN over the years capable of setting out conditions for cooperation between the two. And the EU emphasis on ASEAN minus logic and its exercise of commercial realism, of progressive realism. So sometimes the EU will criticize as relaxing its norm, especially human rights that connected with trade. And the EU tried to engage ASEAN states individually. And the EU also moved in ASEAN plus logic in dialogue, such as ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, East Asian Summit, for example. Do you have any questions about EU-ASEAN relations before we move to EU and Thailand relations? Okay. So we move to my countries, EU and Thailand relations. Well, in the graphic, you see that before we establish the proper diplomatic relations, in 1970, the relation start from the donor recipient, in which again, like in the case of ASEAN, the EU gave Thailand money for helping with the refugee, for helping with education, with grassroots, for example. And then the relations become concrete in 1979 when the delegation of the European Commission established first, in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in Bangkok. And then in 1980s, the EC-ASEAN Cooperation Agreement has signed. In 2005, the negotiations of partnership and cooperation agreement was launched. However, 1 year later, we got a coup d'etat by the military dictator. So the negotiation was paused. And then we have democratically elected government in 2007. The EU-Thailand strategy paper was signed in 2007 to cover until 2013. And then in 2009, the delegation of the EU, of the EC in the past, changed name to be the delegation of the European Union to Thailand in 2009. But it's still be in the same building. And then in 2013, the negotiation on FTA and PCA was briefly restored, but we got a second coup in 2014. So EU suspend all trade talks with Thailand following the coup. So it's a kind of political turmoil with the military in the countries. Maybe you heard about the red shirts, the yellow shirts. The red shirts is the progressive, and then the yellow shirt becomes like the conservatives, royalists. So then in 2019, the EU started to normalize relation with Thailand because the military government at that time arranged the referendum for the draft constitution. So the EU just wait for the sign, like a kind of side of democratic trend. Referendum is one kind of democratic trend. So the EU restore the relationship with Thailand. And then 2022, the PCA was signed. And a year later, in 2020, the FTA negotiations was reopened. And 2024, the PCA was ratified by the Thai Parliament. And now, in 2025, we are at the 5th round of FTA negotiations. And it was arranged in March in Brussels this year. So EU-Thailand relations during the time of donor recipient and until now, right? It's the PCA, economic and trade relations, technical and financial cooperation, civil society engagement, and humanitarian aid. When seeing the economic and trade relations, as I say, EU and Thailand launched negotiations on FTA since 2013. But because we got two coup d'etats, so it haven't concluded yet. We are still on the fifth round of negotiations. EU is Thailand's third trade partner after China and Japan, and Thailand is also EU's third largest trading partner in ASEAN after Singapore and Malaysia. And Thailand is one of the most important destinations of European investment within ASEAN. The EU is the second largest investor in Thailand after Japan. So Thailand will still like have a balance in terms of trade with the EU. And then another aspect after trade is the technical and financial cooperation. The EU provide the technical assistance to help Thailand achieve its development goals. And also now, when the United Nations launched the SDG goals after the Millennium Development Goals, so after the MDGs. So this corresponds with the UN SDG, right? So there were a lot of projects in the country: governance, environment, health, higher education, technology, and economic development. And the EU has engaged a lot with the NGOs, and mostly they were along Thai-Myanmar borders. And the NGO was run either by the EU or by the USAID. And you heard that after Donald Trump come at the second term, right? He tried to dissolve the USAID or the USAID agency. So that quite trouble the refugees along the border that depends on like most of the source, like the EU half and the USAID half. So the EU has engaged a lot with the NGO, the media, academics, grassroots organization, and consult the direction of relations between the two parties and prepare policy papers and development projects, right? Important one is the Thai EU Policy Dialogue Support Facility. So provide the financial assistance for the programs in the past. For the humanitarian aid, the EU, in Bangkok, the EU set up the branch of the ECHO. ECHO is the European Community Humanitarian Office. They have a branch in Bangkok. And ECHO worked with other international organizations to support not only Burmese or Myanmar refugees, but to support Rohingya and Bangladesh nationals under detention in Thailand, right? And much of the funds also provide food, healthcare, and protection of refugees in camps along Thai-Myanmar border. Maybe you're wondering why Thailand did not help at all. Thailand only helped provide the land. The Thai government never ratified the refugee convention, and they never called them as refugee. They call them as a displaced person. Is a kind of legal word to avoid responsibility. They just like, okay, I allow you to be there. But the healthcare, the food, the protection coming from the West, which is Europe and the US. So this is one kind of fund. And then the key projects to Thailand for the last 12 months, the focus area was the sustainable growth and development, human development and migration, environment, and environment and climate change, and support to civil society organization. So the broader corporation, 6.5 million euro. And for SDG implementation and localization, 1.4 million euro. And then just for the refugee Myanmar, that is number one, it's 12 million euro. So now come to some disputes between Thailand and EU relations, in which involves a lot of norm differentiation between Thailand and the EU. We start with the economic dispute then, right? I forgot to ask, I mean, what year are you in? Are you like BA students, MA students, and which year? Or the kind of mixture?
We're all like in different years, I suppose. Like
Undergrad, right?
with different level of education. Yeah, so it's and different universities. So me, for example, I'm like a graduate student right now, and I've graduated. I've graduated my master's degree, but like in political philosophy. But like other people are like from international relations, etc. So also different.
Okay, thank you. So, so I think, I mean, if you will struggle, you will struggle to understand ASEAN more than struggle to understand the EU, because I think you're familiar with the EU more. So, have you heard about the common agricultural policy or common farm policy of the EU? Right. What special was that? I mean, in what angle that you heard about that? Or maybe you can relate to the recent farm export from Ukraine to Europe. Well, actually, the common agricultural policy of the EU, people will think that it's come from France, right? Because France need to fund or subsidize their farmers. But actually, at the beginning in 1960s, it was the idea of France and Germany, two actors, but their purpose are different. France want to use the Europe money to fund their farmers, but German want this money to make the food price cheaper, because the food price in Germany is very expensive. So France was focused on farmers, but Germany was focused on consumers who buy the food. But when the policy was launched, it's come to the direction of the French, in which it subsidized a lot of farmers, right? So you have a situation in the 80s, it's called like Wide Lake, Battle Mountain, and Grain Hills, in which the person who own vineyard going to produce a lot of wine, because the EU going to subsidize it anyway. So it become Wide Lake. Battle Mountain is the farmers in the dairy sector going to do the farming products, and you get the money, something like that. And the Grain Hill is a cereal sector. So the problem with Thailand is the first one in this slide is that Thailand is the largest exporter of cassava or manioc. Maybe you Google it, you know what it is. It's a kind of edible plant, right? a lot of carb. And in 1960, it turns out that there were research and development R&D in the animal feed industry, saying that if you replace the European cereal, which is very expensive, with the cassava or this manioc, the feed cost will be much cheaper, be much lower. So there's a demand of the feed company to import this cassava from Thailand and from Indonesia and Brazil to Europe. So that's going to be the problems of the common agricultural policy, because the previous cereal producer of the EU will lost the market, lost the share, lost benefit, right? So the common agricultural policy, the DG Agriculture came out and says that because Thailand is the largest exporter, they say that the cassava from Thailand is a destabilizing factor for the European agriculture. So what they did is they fly to Thailand and they forced Thailand to sign the thing we call VER. Actually, it's a quota, but it's illegal quota because it's not legalized by the World Trade Organization or the GATT at that time. So it's called voluntary, but in fact, it's forcing voluntary export restraint. So what are the effects after the quota was imposed? So the feed industry have to rebuy the European cereal anyhow, right? So the feed price not low. So animal food price not low. Animal meat still costly. So European consumer was still eating the very expensive food. And also Thailand lost the share to preserve this European Common Agricultural Policy at that time. So this is the first case. And then the second one is the GSP. GSP stands for Generalized System of Preference. The GSP is a kind of like tariff reduction for developing countries. So it's a kind of reward or incentive to the food exports from developing countries. However, the EU, when they decide who to get the benefit, they based on historical a lot. So in the hierarchy of trade preference, right, you will have, of course, free trade among EU members. And then you have the African, the ACP, the African, Caribbean, and the Pacific, right? And you have the MENA, Middle East, and North African region who will get GSP. And then at the bottom is Thailand and China, because Thailand and China never been colonized by any Western power. So we are at the bottom. And then, yeah, of course, Thailand was quite upset because we were cut the GSP during the 2000 on shrimp, on seafood products, and on some part of vegetable, of canned fruit, because the criteria of cutting the GSP, you're supposed to have a lot of market share. If you got a lot of market share, it means that you'll be able to compete, so you'll be cut. But Thailand only export like 5% of the share. And the reason that they cut the GSP, they say that because Thailand was doing great in the US market. So they try to use the US market to validate the European market that, okay, Thailand was great in the US market. So Thailand not supposed to get like a tariff reduction in terms of seafood products. And then we also mess up because we have tsunami. Have you seen like a documentary on tsunami, like the big wave in 2006, maybe? Yeah, no. Yeah, there were like a big wave and then they eating people up from the beach, right? And then we try to use this argument to get the GSP back because it's destroyed the coastal fishing, but it's not successful. And then we received it, but took 10 years to argue that we got lesser shares in the EU market, and then our coastal fishing routes was damaged, for example. And then the next one is the issue of food purity. I don't know whether you're aware that the EU standard on food safety is much higher than the US and Japan because the EU used the concept of zero tolerance. But when you put something into the machine to test, you will still have 1 part per billion residue anyhow. So you will get vet, medication residue, or the toxic substance. And then there's one case that very interesting is that in 2002, the University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, they just invent a new machine which could detect a very refined and defined residue. So they test it by place it at the Rotterdam port. So it turns out that all the food that passed the Rotterdam port was alert of residue. But the same product that passed to other countries like French port or Barcelona or other European members countries was not found any toxic substance. So we try to protest that you use the new machine and the new machine haven't completed yet. And it's a kind of double standard because you didn't use the whole machine. But in the end, we have to become the technology followers because later the EU used this Rotterdam machine in all the ports. And then we try to counter back because it's come from the Dutch, right? We use like the baby powder milk to brands of the Dutch. And then we use the same machine to test. And we found the same residue and toxic substance in the Dutch milk powder. And then we write a letter. The Thai exporter write a letter to the health authority of Dutch. And then the Dutch replied that we inspect all the food that sell in our country or export to other countries, but we didn't use that machine. So it's so funny. So it's a kind of very, very double standard at that time. But now they use this machine. And EU standard was by far higher than the US, higher than the international standard like sanitary and phytosanitary measures and Codex Alimentarius. So we need to come back and rethink that. What are we looking for? Are we looking for food safety or are we looking for food purity? Because food purity was so difficult to achieve. So that's the other thing. And then for the pollution, the EU issued the emission trading scheme in which they will charge in this industry that produce carbon emission a lot, right? And we're going to affect in the aviation sector because, but you can see that when you fly from Asia to Europe, you will get cheaper price when you fly with the Middle East or Arabic airlines like Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airways, because the EU will charge the carbon emission only the final flight that enter Europe. So from Doha to Paris, or from Abu Dhabi to Paris, or from which is 6 hours. But for us, Thai Airways, it's 12 hours or 11 hours. So we recharge this carbon emission much more than the Arabic or the Middle East flight or Turkish flight. So we're going to lose competitiveness in this relation. And then also the issue of air safety. We were alert the red flag by the US ICAO, but actually it's International Civil Aviation Organization. But we didn't have the direct flight to the US. But the European Aviation Safety Agency started to inspect us as well into the Thailand's aviation system. And it's quite a shame that our quality, they say that our ranking of air safety standards rank lowest among ASEAN countries. Why is that? Because in terms of Western standard, you need to go to training, a lot of training. But you imagine Thai technicians, they just feel like, oh, that's what I do every day. I'm very good at it. No need for training, something like that. So we didn't have this kind of training mindset. So which is bad. And then it's not meet regular international standard. So we are lowest among ASEAN countries. And then the economic condition again in the fishery sector is the IUU. This one is very important because we got the yellow card from the EU. EU pressure on Thailand fishery on IUU. What is IUU? IUU is the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Because EU worried about food security, and EU is the third largest buyer of fishery products from Thailand after US and Japan. And Thailand got a lot of illegal labor, people smuggling problems. Because IUU did not only to protect the extinction of fish, but it see all the fishing as integrated, even the bed of the fish. So in October 2014, the EU come to inspect Thai fishing industry. A year later, yellow card issued to Thailand. So we must solve it within 6 months. And we are under the military government. So in a way, it's quick because military is going to say, go out this day like that. So the Royal Thai Navy took charge instead of Department of Fisheries because we are under the coup leaders. So the Navy become the head of the command center for combating illegal fishing. And then Thailand launched their national plan of action to prevent, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing. So now the yellow card was canceled. And then, as I mentioned a bit, that we got a lot of coup, we got political turmoil. So the EU will issue a lot of statements, like the statement calling for election and protection of human rights. And that's when the EU say that if we consider its engagement, official visits to and from Thailand have been suspended. And the EU also called for the martial law or the military law to be lifted, and also the show the wariness of the student detention, the protester detention that was directed to the political turmoil. But the thing that the EU campaigned for a long time but not successful is the abolition of death penalty. They did with Japan as well, but both Japan and Thailand will still do capital punishment. The EU succeed only the abolition of under 20 of age execution. And then the next one, Thailand never signed the treaties related to war crimes. So this is the way they did. So for the Thailand-EU relations and this normative differentiation, we see that EU influence on Thailand have been more on economic norm pressure rather than political ones through the use of reward and punishment on Thai food export, aviation sector, but has limited roles in political norms in persuasion on the call for election and protection of human rights, abolition of death penalty, and the signing of war crime treaties. And the EU has refrained to use economic pressure to be the conditions for political change in Thailand. This is different from Myanmar, in which the EU do a lot more sanctions than Thailand, because the EU's consumers still rely on food, goods, and service from Thailand, right? And normative pressure may change after 2017 because the financial that's going to give to Thailand will move from the development organ of the EU to the foreign policy of the EU. So it's going to be tied with the political more. So I finished now. Do you have any questions or comments?
I can see that we have already 3 hands from our participants. So Tatiana, please, your hand was first.
Thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting. And I have a question. And it's interesting for me. Is it difficult for ASEAN countries to negotiate and reach a consensus, given the political diversity among the member states, unlike the EU, where there is a great similarity in political systems, and it's not just about political systems, but about cultures, because Asia is known for its culture diversity. So it's interesting for me.
Right, Tatiana. You mean the difference in ASEAN countries, right? Yeah. Yeah, you raised very good question, because I forgot to tell you about some ASEAN norms, because well, among ASEAN member states, it's like at first we have 6 members only without the socialist country. And then after the end of the Cold War, we add more for the socialist countries to become 10. And at the beginning, when we have only 6, because we have a lot of political clashes among one another, the border disputes. So the founders try to set the ASEAN norms. We called it ASEAN way. And we found it very funny. The ASEAN norm is that you never criticize your neighbors' domestic affairs. And 2 is that if you have problems solved within ASEAN, you won't bring to the head, to the World Court, to the International Court. And the 3rd one, you need to consult and the vote going to be consensus, not the majority voting like the EU. So these are the three things that will hold ASEAN together. And when the Myanmar case happened, we just like turn the blind eye on. We just don't talk about Myanmar in the agenda at all, in which the EU upset, right? That ASEAN is supposed to be the person who make the situation of Myanmar better. So that's and then when you have the CLMV or the new four socialist state coming, and this four socialist state is not that unified like the previous six, especially in relations with China, because China invests a lot in the Belt and Road, invest in the port, in these four new states. So when we have an issue, the common issue of the South China Sea, in which we have territorial dispute between ASEAN members and China, we cannot produce like the common voice because the four new states not going to issue the same memorandum or agree to have the resolutions to condemn China. So that's a problem in terms of politics, in terms of political issues. But economic issues is, I think it's doing fine. And then the second
Thank you
question.
for your answer.
Okay.
Okay, Artem, please.
Thank you very much for your insights lecture and different perspective on the EU particularly. I'm interested and curious about what is the Great Britain stance in the region and what its bilateral relations with Thailand as well. Is the United Kingdom tries to play a significant and different role from the Europe and be like a great power apart from other European states? Thank you.
Yes, interesting question. Because well, after 2016 Brexit, right? Well, Brexit is a sign that in the past, in the UK foreign policy, we called it Winston Churchill Majestic Circle. They got three circles. The first circle is the US and NATO. And the second one is the former colonies, the Commonwealth. And the third one is the EU. During the time of the EU, they think that the circle of the EU was dear to them. But Brexit showed that they want to do it all. They want a global Britain, right? So they launched a strategy. The first one in 2021 by Boris Johnson. And that's the word global Britain again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the integrated review. That review was focused on Indo-Pacific, added from the previous transatlantic circle. And they talk about, they send Navy fleet to oversee, to keep an eye on China Sea or keep an eye on China, something like that. But the next document by Rishi Sunak, the Integrated Review 2023, I mean, the interest or the mentioning of the region Indo-Pacific was less. Yeah. But there were still the change again because we have like Labour government, Keir Starmer, and it seems that they come back to interest in Indo-Pacific because of economic. They, the Foreign Secretary Lamy, they launched the new policy called, what's that? Progressive realism. But actually, I mean, the name sounds nice, right? Progressive realism. But actually, it's a mercantilism. It's like oh, I'm going to relax the norm, but I'm going to trade with these countries by David Lam. So I think Indo-Pacific will be in Britain focus. And they also send their fighting fleet, two of the fighting fleet in the region. Yeah, before there's only the fleet from France, but
Mhm.
now we have the British fleet in the area of thought. And as I mentioned Indo-Pacific before, that there's a potential flashpoint because um, after the issues of the war in Ukraine, and Japan works a lot to the idea that you heard that Japan Prime Minister gave a speech and said that we're going to be like Ukraine, right? If we did not contain China, something like that. So it's a kind of proxy and kind of Ukrainization of East Asia, something like that, in the argument that Indo-Pacific is the area that major powers need to focus and to
Mhm.
prevent, not to have uh, like the thing that Ukraine has, something like that. Yeah, to prevent the crisis. Mhm.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you, Yana.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for being here today and sharing your experience and knowledge with us. And I suppose you have already briefly answered this question, but it's still a bit unclear to me. Like when it comes to any kind of common policy within ASEAN, for example, as we said, like there were some agreements with the European Union. So are there any like actual enforcements or regular like mechanism to regulate these agreements and common policy, or is it more about like memorandums and voluntary membership, like cooperation between the members? Because the demonstrative example was in 2021, after the military coup in Myanmar, when ASEAN adopted a 5 point like sort of consensus, but it was not followed at all, and there was no even attention to this memorandum. But at the same time, there were already agreements on human rights and other things we talked about with the European Union. So did it have like any negative effect on the relations between the members of the organization and the European Union, or it already was like the process adopted that the European Union cooperates more on the bilateral basis with the countries? And the following question, like if it is like this, like as you said, the European Union started to focus more on bilateral foundation since 2018. So if it was already like this, then are there any sort of enforcements for the particular countries? So like as we said, Thailand, it cooperates with China, and there are some requirements and like documents signed with the European Union. So how is it possible to balance between all this and be committed to some of the regulations of the European Union and being involved in Belt and Road infrastructure buildings and so on? I hope you got my question, because I think I made it too
I
complicated.
try. I try. It's very difficult question. Yes, you point out like the weaknesses of ASEAN, like in the case of ASEAN 5 point consensus, it's not actually have a kind of actually serious enforcement because within the ASEAN 5 point consensus, I think Cambodia did not feel right into it. And it didn't work out. It just say, okay, negotiation, ceasefire. It didn't work out that way. And most of the agreement, I mean, with the EU, no legal enforcement except the PCA that you need to pass through the parliament of individual countries. Yeah, and you raised interesting question that how we navigate with China. But because the relation with the EU is quite cautious. I mean, compared to Britain, like Britain's strategy in Indo-Pacific, going to pinpoint that China is a systematic threat and source of threat. But the EU, we use the word like-minded, but we know in our mind that China is not EU like-minded, but they did not say it outright. So that's make Thailand get away and hedging and be able to hedge with different actors. Yeah, I would say. Thank you for all the questions. What are the topic tomorrow evening? Or tomorrow evening, no class?
I'd like to use my kind of privilege as a moderator and to ask my own question. Again, you partly mentioned the relations of the regional states with actors, other external actors apart from EU, like China and the US. And overall, the ASEAN states are very well known for their balancing between these different external actors, and especially currently at the time of kind of escalating geopolitical tensions. What could you outline? Perhaps that's a complicated topic to do it briefly, but overall, your perspective on the place of the region in this current competition between US and China, and how does or do the regional states in general view themselves there, and in the context of their relations with these actors and with the European Union?
Yes, in the US-China rivalry, I would say that you have in the region you have Philippines in one end, the Philippines, and you have Myanmar in the other end. Start from the Philippines. Philippines will balance against China because they are loyal and strong allies of the US since the Cold War even now. And then from the Philippines, going to be like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, in which they are hedging both US and China. And there's a lot of investment from China as well in the country. And then you have a kind of Cambodia, Brunei, in which there are the possibility of debt trap with China because of China invests a lot in terms of hardware, in terms of infrastructure in their countries, and then giving the loans to the countries. And then on the other end, you got Myanmar, in which they didn't like both China and US because the Tatmadaw or the coup did not be approved by the Chinese government. So the only friends that they have, I mean, the Myanmar Tatmadaw military dictator is Russia. So this is completely different. Yeah, completely different case. Yeah, in the relation in the Sino-US rivalry. So like you say, I mean, your previous students say it's very, very dynamic in the region.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I can see that Jana has another question, right?
Yeah, this one is shorter and I think less complicated one. Like, I'm just wondering, with like all the EU and Thailand partnerships, would you say there is a visible shift towards EU style values, let's say this way, on the ground, or is there like impact is more symbolic just in terms of the trade?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the different direction. I think the EU keep relaxing nowadays. I see the trend that the FTA going to be. I mean, if we don't have another coup from the military, because we just have the problems between the Prime Minister, Thai Prime Minister, and Cambodian leaders. I don't know whether you know the league, right? The chair of the league. So if we don't have another coup, right? I think FTA will come real quick. And there's a lot of norm relaxation this day. I think the EU also think about this economic realism and the need to diversify the energy sources, diversify the food sources, and diversify the semiconductor sources, and also from the war. So I think it needs to be symbolic, like you said.
I see. Thank you.
Okay, and we have just a couple of minutes of the designated time for this lecture, and since there are no more raised hands or messages in the chat that I can see, Dr. Khunmas will thank you again for agreeing to join us and to have this lecture. It has been really, as our participants mentioned, very insightful and interesting. So thank you again, and we will not hold you any longer because it must already be quite late where you are. So yes,
10:30 p.m. Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah. Wish you all the best.
Yeah. Thank you, and hoping for future communication and cooperation.